Welcome to Trench Diaries. Sword Beach, Part 2. I was able to extend our periscope up over the top of the bunker roof and turn it around to the inland side. It was difficult to make out anything there, but I kept watching. I also had my men watching the seaward plateau with binoculars, of course, and reporting to me on what they could see. The tension was very great, as we all knew it was now a matter of time before an attack came. There was flak fire from the south, and there were flares going into the sky on the horizon. Then, after some time, as I looked through the periscope towards the rear of our site, in the moonlight I could see a descending shape which did not appear to be a parachute. This was a large shape, and it appeared to be emitting fire and sparks from its tail end. I believed at first that this was some large rocket of some kind, or maybe even some form of a jet-propelled aircraft, but then I realized that it was in fact a simple glider which was on fire, presumably from being hit by the flak. It slowly reared up and flopped down directly onto our position, still on fire. It landed so close that it went below the line of sight of my periscope, but immediately there was gunfire from that side of the position. Our guard troops there were fighting against these glider attackers, whoever they were. Out to sea, there was nothing unusual to observe in the dark, and there was no report of activity on the plateau. I had the men send up a white flare to illuminate the plateau so that we could be certain. I therefore considered that this assault might be a localized commando-type raid rather than part of a full-scale invasion, but of course there was no way of knowing what eventual form this would take. I telephoned up to the observation room and received a report of close-quarters fighting between airborne troops and our men in the battery position to the rear. It was reported that these troops appeared to be English, and they were causing and receiving substantial casualties. I said, it was only one glider, and how many troops can they carry in one glider? But what was happening, I later learned, was that the glider troops were creating a gap in the defenses for the paratroopers outside the position, and these paratroopers were storming into the battery itself and surrounding the bunkers. So, we were to some extent under siege from that point on. At that point it was very agonizing, because our whole purpose was to fire onto the plateau and the coast, which was still empty. The 20 men locked inside my bunker were simply unable to fight back against this assault from the land side. I could hear explosions and shooting near the back of our bunker itself, coming through the metal door at the rear. At the same time, when I tried to use our telephone again, I found that the line was dead. We were not equipped with the radio, so we were cut off from information. I listened at the steel door, and I could hear debris from explosions hitting it repeatedly. This was a great shock to me, because if the enemy troops got onto the roof of our bunker, or close to the embrasure, they would be able to fire into us uncontested or throw grenades into the bunker. I ordered several men to come to the door with rifles and be ready to force back any attempted entry there. At the same time, I shouted from the seaward embrasure for troops to come to our assistance. However, there was no answer or signal from troops on that side of us. In this way, we had to endure several minutes of waiting, as fighting took place outside our bunker without knowing the real situation. The men became frustrated and offered to break out through the rear door to clear the approaches. I did not permit this, as opening the door during action was forbidden by orders, and we did not know the enemy's strength outside. The situation was brought to an end very violently when the enemy began to fire their guns into the ventilator system at the rear of the bunker. This caused pieces of the ventilator fans to smash off, and a large number of bullets came out of the ventilator ducts and ricocheted around the inside of the bunker. These bullets hit 2 of our men, one of whom was killed instantly, and the other was blinded. I ordered sandbags to be brought to block off the ducts. As the men were bringing these across from under the embrasure, 2 small bombs came out of the duct tubing, evidently having been thrown in by the enemy outside. My men shouted warnings and threw themselves flat on the floor away from these bombs. I took in the situation with a heart that, frankly, was pounding with sheer dread. In appearance, these bombs were like large grenades, grey in color. One of my men had the intelligence to throw a sandbag that he was holding onto one bomb and cover it. However, the other bomb remained on the floor. I went to grab a sandbag from another man who was backing away from the bombs when both of them exploded. The one under the sandbag did not detonate properly and caused only a lot of dust and smoke. However, the loose one on the floor exploded fully and caused a very white flash, which spread an incendiary material out in a ball several meters wide. The incendiary ball was horribly blinding, and it hung in the air for what seemed like a long time. I was transfixed at the sight, as I had not seen an explosion like this before, and I did not know what it meant. Then the fireball collapsed onto the floor and spread out in a manner I would describe as volcanic. This white burning matter enveloped several men nearby who were flat on the floor, and it took hold of their bodies completely. Their uniforms were burned off in moments, and their bare skin was blackened and charred. Whole pieces of their flesh became black in moments and began to disintegrate. These men screamed and convulsed in a dreadful way, and the other men backed away from them in a rush. I shouted for order to be restored and for a fire extinguisher. I also had the men throw more sandbags onto the ventilated ducts to prevent more bombs coming through. Luckily, our immediate ammunition supply was kept in a steel-clad unit on the opposite wall, so fortunately it was not detonated. The trapdoor to the lower chambers, where there was the main ammunition store, was also not touched by the flames. There were 200 rounds of high explosive down there, and an explosion would probably have demolished the entire battery. Sadly, it was not possible to save the burned men. The fire extinguisher was used, but they were severely burned. I think that both of them were dead, and the third was alive but moving in a terrible torment. His neck and chest were completely burned open, and his skin was smoldering even after the extinguisher was applied. It was inconceivable that anything could be done for him. So, a Feldwebel asked my permission to put him out of his misery. After some hesitation, I gave it. So, he was shot cleanly in the head. I personally would have wished the same thing for myself in such a situation. Afterwards, the men were cursing and denouncing the English. We could hear the attackers outside kicking or beating at the steel door to gain entry, and there were other explosions in the air ducts from explosives that they threw in there, but these explosions were muffled by the sandbags. The air inside the bunker was now full of smoke and charred particles, and the men who were away from the embrasure donned their gas masks. All this happened in the space of a few seconds, maybe 20. I personally was in an absolute fury at this situation, as we were being steadily choked and suffocated instead of fighting properly, as we were intended to. I tried to look through the periscope to see the situation, but the optic was cracked and it was inoperable. I ordered 2 men to climb out of the main seaward embrasure with MP40s, in order to shoot down any enemy who were on the roof or trying to reach down to the embrasure. As soon as they climbed out, there was shooting, and they were both hit by shots from the roof. They fell out of the concrete slit onto the minefield area underneath, and they were both blown up badly by the anti-personnel mines, which were positioned to stop the enemy getting close to the front of the bunker. Then, I myself took an MP40 and went over the embrasure to see the situation. Just as I approached, I saw 2 hands appear from the upper edge of the slit. These were the hands of the enemy, surely, because these hands were holding a Thompson submachine gun, which was clearly silhouetted against the sky outside. The gun muzzle was smoking slightly. This soldier was presumably lying on top of the roof and reaching down with his gun. As you can imagine, an absolute storm of fire was directed at this man, from my gun and the men's. And before he could fire any more rounds, his gun was shot out of his hands and it went flying off into the minefield. I could now hear the enemy troops outside, talking and shouting in English. I could hear them saying words like bomb, man, and fire, which sounded like the words we have in German. The fact was, if we did not have infantry remaining outside to guard against a close attack like this, there was nothing that we could do to drive off these assailants. We had a very small supply of stick grenades, and I took one of these, primed it, and then attempted to throw it out of the slip up onto the roof. As I reached out, I was shot through the forearm. I dropped my grenade, which exploded below without effect. I was stunned from this wound and the explosion, and as I gathered my senses, I saw one of these English soldiers reach down and throw in another of the grey-colored incendiary bombs which they had used on the air ducts. This bomb exploded against the gun shield, and it covered the shield in that bright incendiary material. The shield was thick enough to withstand this, but some of the incendiary fluid shot around the edges and hit the men in the gun crew, causing terrible burns. I knew that, with 1 or 2 more of those bombs, our whole bunker crew would be wiped out. So, I decided that the gun position was simply indefensible in the current state of the combat. I never thought of surrender. In fact, I hated the idea of surrendering to a lightly armed force. I knew that the German infantry around our sector must surely be arriving imminently to fight off the attacking troops. It was inconceivable that they would not come to assist us against a small airborne force. I therefore ordered the men to open the trapdoor which led down to the lower chambers and to take cover in there. I ordered the firing mechanism from the gun to be removed and brought with us. The men obeyed rapidly, and in a few seconds they were moving down into the underground space. The wounded were brought down as carefully as possible, and medical supplies were available in the underground rooms. As I followed the men down the steps, I saw the English attackers jump down from the roof onto the ledge of the embrasure and begin shooting wildly into the interior, absolutely spraying the inside with bullets. There were 2 of these men, and they had submachine guns which they simply jerked left and right, filling the whole bunker with shots. I caught sight of their faces, and I can tell you that the glimpse alarmed me as much as anything I had seen that day. Their faces were set rigid, in an expression of absolute hatred, sheer hatred. This worried me greatly. Why would men, who were the same race as us, who were physically similar to us, why would they hate us in this way? Why would they want to burn us alive when we were protecting Europe? What was the origin of this hatred? I had no answer to such questions at the time. I dropped onto the top step of the underground chamber and I secured the steel door over us. I could only use one hand because of the wound of my forearm, which was extremely painful. The steel plate was echoing with bullets which were deflecting off of it. Below the door, we had a concrete block which rolled on 2 girders to sit across the trapdoor entrance. I opened this block across the steps. We were now sealed into the underground chamber, with the enemy running loose in our bunker overhead. Below the door, we had a concrete block which rolled on 2 girders to sit across the trapdoor entrance, effectively blocking it. I operated this block across the steps, which meant we were now sealed inside the underground chamber, with the enemy running loose in the bunker overhead. In theory, we could last in this bunker for a very long time. There was dry food stockpiled which would last many weeks. Water was limited, but there were medical supplies. There was a single electric lamp which gave a feeble light, worked by a hand-cranked dynamo. There were also 2 air vents which ran to concealed covers outside the bunker, and as long as these were not blocked we could breathe. But my hope was that we would only have to wait an hour or so until the surrounding German troops counterattacked and took back the battery. Of course, above us we could hear the sound of the enemy moving about in the bunker. It was a dreadful sensation, knowing that they were in our superb bunker, no doubt intent on destroying our guns. The immediate danger was that they would use explosives to open the steel trap door and drop their incendiary bombs down into the chamber. The walls down here were lined with ammunition for the gun. I think there were probably 20 tons of explosives in there. These shells were unprotected and might be set off by an incendiary or even a bullet. We crouched there and looked up at the roof over us as the English up there began to set off explosions and smash our equipment. We heard their voices in a muffled way through the steel door. It was extremely hot and smoky in the chamber, and sweat ran down my face as I crouched there, wrapping a bandage around my wounded arm and looking at the trap door. Several times we heard the enemy soldiers treading on the trap door or stamping or kicking at it. They must have known that we were underneath, because where else would we all have gone? At one point, we heard an explosion directly above us on the steel plate itself, suggesting that the enemy were trying to blast it open to get at us. The thought of those incendiary grenades coming down into our confined space was horrifying. Some of my men began praying, while others kept up a stream of muttered obscenities directed at the enemy, vowing a dreadful revenge for this humiliation. All this went on for about 15 minutes in all, and then the explosions above us stopped. I listened at the steel plate and could not hear footsteps or impacts up there. Some of the men asked me not to open the door, while others told these men to shut up and begged to be allowed up there to fight. I told all the men to shut it, and I rolled aside a concrete slab on its girders, then listened again, before opening the trapdoor slightly. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you know how the algorithm works. Like, comment, subscribe. It means a lot to me. See you in the next video.